if you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got. And so endurance is a huge part of it. And then I would say with its anxiety, it's the same thing. It's like, or very much the same. You're terrified and uncertain, but you move ahead to the best of your ability. And again, you operate at least to some degree on hope. And if you haven't got hope, then you've got blind, bloody endurance. And that's all motivated by some sense that you're working towards something that's worthwhile working toward, and that is, that's your own long-term well-being, to treat yourself properly. It's the stability and productivity and harmony and health of your family. That's a huge deal. And then it's whatever benefit you can be to the community. And if you have to limp along and drag yourself forward in order to maintain that pathway, then so be it, because it's better than the alternative.
You need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it, and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because they need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failure. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal.
I think a tremendous amount of what you might regard as shadow integration, which in the parlance of behavioral psychologists would be something like assertiveness training, right? It's training in how to stand up for yourself and for your, let's say, for your better self, which would be the self that you could use productively over a medium to long period of time that would be of use to you, but also of use to people around you. So it's a self that's bounded by the necessity of taking care of yourself, but also simultaneously taking care of the people around you. I think that the simplest way to start that work is to consult your resentment. You know, it's easy to become bitter about life and to become angry because, of course, life is difficult and it's full of disappointments, and people are also subject to betrayal on the part of themselves and on the part of people that hypothetically care for them. And so it's easy to get bitter and to be resentful. And resentment is a very useful emotion, even though I think it's one of the most damaging emotions if it's not dealt with properly. So if you're resentful, it basically means only one of two things. It either means you should grow up and quit whining and get on with your life, or it means that you're being subject to tyrannical forces of one form or another, maybe emanating from you, maybe a consequence of the natural environment, maybe a consequence of society. You're being subject to tyrannical forces and you're not putting your own best interests forward, like in that broader sense that I described. And I don't mean your selfish, narrow interests that only serve the purposes of instantaneous gratification. I mean your own best interests in terms of developing your character over the span of your life. If you're resentful, it either means that you're immature and that you should grow the hell up. And so you need to figure out how much of your resentment is that, and maybe allied with the desire to find other things or people to blame. But the other possible option is that you have something to say or do, right? Because you're in a situation where you're violating your own internal ethical standards and you're being required, pressured, let's say, to say things you don't believe or to do things that you believe to be wrong. And you need to determine, you need to start to strategize and plan how you can rectify that so that you can say what you mean. Like if you're negotiating with a marital partner, for example, and there are issues in your marriage that aren't making you happy, well, the first thing is you have to take note of that, right? To see that you're actually unhappy. The second is that you have to be willing to engage in a certain amount of conflict, because in order to sort out what's disturbing you, you're going to have to lay your concerns out on the table and say, well, look, this is bothering me. You don't have to say, well, I'm right and you're wrong and you have to fix this. You have to say, well, I've noticed that this pattern of interaction or lack of interaction, say, in our relationship is making me resentful and angry. And the danger of that, of course, is you're going to take it out on yourself and your partner. The danger is passive aggressiveness. You know, you're not going to respond to your partner positively when they do something good if you're resentful about them. And you're not going to respond to yourself properly. And so you have to lay it out on the table, but sort of in a spirit of ignorant humility. It's like, look, I'm frustrated. I'm feeling this way about our relationship. Here's what I think might be going wrong, maybe on my part and maybe on your part. And here's what I envision as a possible solution. That's also really necessary if you're going to say what you have to say, which is to manifest yourself properly in the world. Is you can't just complain about what's wrong. You have to think, well, what would my minimal preconditions for satisfaction be? One of the things I've thought about a fair bit is the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. And as far as I can tell, it's basically a two-part wisdom. The first is that you should aim at the highest good that you can imagine. And that would be a good that includes everyone, right? So if I wanted what was good for you, say, if I genuinely wanted it, I'd want it in a way that was good for you now and good in the long run and good for you and your family and your community and maybe good for me too. You know, you could conceive of that as the desire. And I think that's a good definition of love, is that you actually want the best, you want the best possible outcome. And in the Gospels, of course, that's extended even to your enemies.
Yes.
Right? Is that, okay, if we're going to have things good, let's have it good enough for even the people that set themselves up against me. Because if the world was running properly, things would be good for them too. And that would be better. And it seems to me that that's a very good way of looking at things. It's a difficult way of looking at things. And then the second part of the Sermon on the Mount is something like, having established that as your aim, which is no easy thing, by the way, right? Because you have to be pretty clear-headed and single-minded to actually want that to be your aim. Then you can concentrate on the day and you can try telling the truth. And you can ally, so there's truth and love that are allied together. Truth, love, and attention, it's something like that are all allied together. In the future authoring program, we built this section where you have to outline your most dismal future, right? What your future would be like if you let all your bad habits and characterological weaknesses have the upper hand. And the reason we did this is because you can't straighten yourself out merely as a consequence of hope. Let's say you lay out a vision for the future and you think about what your life would be, what you'd like your life to be like. And then that makes you hopeful and it motivates you because it gives you something worthwhile and higher order to work for, right? And that's useful. That's positive emotion working for you because positive emotion is experienced in relationship to goals. But it's not as useful as also being chased by something you're terrified by. And if you have a good sense of how you'd fall apart if you stayed weak and just exactly what kind of hell that would be, then when you determine to do something like to tell the truth and to say what you think and to not do things that you hate, then you're going to be pulled along by the purpose that your vision has provided for you, but also pushed along by your desire to avoid the worst forms of hell that you've already outlined for yourself personally. And that can also help you be brave enough to stand up in a situation that would require conflict, because if you have something to say and you have something to negotiate about with someone, then there's going to be a certain amount of conflictual dialogue that accompanies that, right? To lay out a set of problems and to describe the fact forthrightly that those problems characterize a relationship and then to seek for solutions is quite stressful in the short term. And it's really easy to avoid. And so people avoid it all the time. And then they store up grievances across the span of their relationships. And eventually the grievances mount to the point where they return in monstrous form and just eat everything up. That's where you get divorces, or that's where you explode at your boss and end up fired, or that's where you develop high blood pressure over 15 years because you can't stand all the accumulated monsters in your closet, and then you drink yourself into oblivion because you can't stand your life. That's all, very counterproductive. But it's easy to avoid that necessary conflict on a moment-to-moment basis because it's very stressful to speak forthrightly about genuine conflicts, especially when you're dealing with important parts of your life. But otherwise you don't straighten them out, and then you have to carry all that forward. So you need to be terrified of the consequences of not speaking your piece. And that can counterbalance the terror of actually trying to have a conversation. Add small goals. Now, if that doesn't work, like if you can't make the goals small enough to achieve, it might be that you're not being humble enough with regards to your conceptions of your own ability. But you can tell if the goal that you put forward is a reasonable one if you're actually implementing it. Because if you're not, then by definition, it's not a reasonable goal. Like let's say you're sleeping all the time and your room is just a bloody complete disaster. And you think, well, I should clean up my room. It's like, well, maybe you can't, but maybe tomorrow you could hang up 2 shirts, or you could move 2 shirts from your bedroom to the laundry room, or you could bag up a bag of dirty clothes that you could conceivably take to a laundromat. And you just do that one thing, If your room's a catastrophe and you do that one thing and then you did one thing like that for 15 days or 20 days, maybe your place would be in order. And so the trick is to get the trajectory right.
You want to present yourself to the world in a manner that that doesn't disgrace you in some sense. That might be a good way to think about it. And you don't want to disgrace yourself, because the consequence of disgrace is emotional dysregulation, more pain, less positive emotion. And so the best way to present yourself is to stand up forthrightly and to stretch out, and to occupy some space, and you make yourself sort of vulnerable by doing that, because you open up the front of your body, right? But it's a sign of confidence, and that way people are most likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's a good way to start regulating your mood. But not only does it directly regulate your mood to stand up, because it's so tightly associated, like postural flexion is associated with serotonin and emotional regulation, but also because if you straighten up and you present yourself in that manner, then other people are more likely to take you seriously. And that means they'll start treating you as if you're a #1 lobster instead of a #10 lobster. And that's another way that you can at least give yourself the bloody benefit of the doubt, right? And confront the world in a courageous manner. Life is difficult, and it's harder to do things than not to do them, and it's harder to do them well than to do them badly. And it's easy to sit around and be hopeless. I don't mean it's emotionally easy, because it's not, but it's procedurally easy to be useless and to fall back into your old habits and to not discipline yourself. And it's a matter of continual practice, slow continual practice. And I think a good example of that is something like weightlifting. If you start a weightlifting program, which I would recommend, by the way, because it's tremendously advantageous physically and cognitively, you're not going to really see results for a number of weeks, and then the results are rather slow, but you can get pretty decent results over a 6-month period, and absolutely stellar results over a couple of years. And so you have to make sure your time frame is right and not to be too hard on yourself. And I did mention the future authoring program earlier, and one of the things I would recommend too is, if you're having a hard time implementing your decisions, say your ethical decisions, that you spend a bit more time thinking them through and writing them down. And the future authoring program is really helpful for that. That's why we designed it. And so get your goals straight and continue to practice every day. And if you're not succeeding, then make your goals slightly smaller. You want to make your goals large enough so that they challenge you, but small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of succeeding at them on a day-to-day basis. And then you have to also understand that if you fail on a given day, like let's say you're trying to quit smoking and you quit for 2 weeks, and then you have a cigarette and you think, oh my God, now I've screwed it up. I'm not quitting anymore. You smoke a whole pack of cigarettes. It's like, well, there's a couple of mistakes there. And one is, well, just because you had a cigarette doesn't mean you failed. It just means that you had a cigarette. You can start stopping again the next day. And the fact that you had 1 cigarette in the last 2 weeks is a hell of a lot better than the 2 weeks that you had before that. And so you've got to be realistically humble. You've got to be ambitious enough in your goals so that you're pursuing something that you regard as truly meaningful and worthwhile. And maybe you can judge that to some degree if you think about someone you love attempting the same thing, and think about how you would feel if they managed it. And if you would feel good, then that's probably a good what would you say? That would be a good evaluation strategy to use on yourself. So you want your goals to be of sufficient nobility so that you can live with yourself properly if you're pursuing them, but you want them to be small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of implementing them. I talk to people about taking care of themselves like there's someone who they have responsibility for. And that's not a political issue too. It's an injunction to assuming that you have a certain intrinsic value, and that it's necessary for that value to manifest itself, for you to push yourself against the world, to challenge yourself, because otherwise what you're capable of won't manifest itself. It has to be developed. It has to be called forth by necessity, right? You have to pick a hard problem and try to solve it and push yourself against it and you have to try to do that truthfully and responsibly in order for what it is that you're intrinsically capable of and composed of to come to the forefront. And that seems like a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned, to encourage people to be responsible for themselves and for other people, and also to point out that you have a moral responsibility to do so
for yourself just as you do for others. And I think that message has been very helpful to people. At least that's what they've told me. And it's predicated, the rule is predicated on the old Judeo-Christian idea, the oldest idea in some sense, that, that there's a relationship between logos, which is truthful speech and communication, and bringing things into being from chaotic potential. That's the idea that's put forward in Genesis. And also the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God, which suggests that, like God, we have the capability of affecting potential, affecting the possible future and turning it into the actual present, and that we do that, at least in part, as a consequence of our ethical choices.
Weak people are a problem in general. And I don't mean physically weak, I mean cowardly, let's say, and deceitful, because I'm thinking it more in terms of moral weakness. Well, there's a variety of reasons. First of all, if you can't support your own weight, let's say, then someone else has to do it. And that's not good. And then if you don't make your pathway, if you don't pick a forthright and useful and noble pathway through life, then you'll become bitter and too hurt by the tragedy of existence. And then you tend to seek your revenge wherever you can get it. And that's not good. So it's a mistake on all fronts. It's not good for you. It's not good for your family. It's not good for the community. It's certainly not a good medium to long-term strategy, because life is very, very difficult, and you have to be prepared for that. And I had a watcher the other night. He was at my lecture in Oslo, and he wrote me a letter. He was a 17-year-old boy, and he said that my work had been very helpful to him. His father had died suddenly about 6 months before, and he found his dad when he was dying and was very, very shocked and horrified and hurt by what had happened. And I had recommended on my YouTube lectures that one thing you could aim for was to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. And so that's what he did. And he helped his mom, and he wrote a 200-word eulogy and got through it. And so good for him. That's strength and necessary. It's a terrible thing that happened, but he did everything he could not to make it any worse than it had to be.
But do you never see that showing weakness can be a strength too?
Not weakness, vulnerability. That's a whole different thing. To admit to the fact that you're vulnerable, that's a form of courage. That's not a form of weakness. But that leads you to take whatever steps are necessary to deal with that properly. It isn't some facade that you're invulnerable. No one is invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination.
All of the people that I know who have become successful in any way use a structured means to organize their time. They have lists of things to do, like they have every day, there's a list of things to do that day. Every week, there's a list of things to do that week. Every month, there's a list of things to do that month. You know, at every level of temporal resolution, there's a sequence of plans, and those plans are implemented on a day-to-day basis. You cannot be, and successful isn't the right way of thinking about it, because I'm not thinking about, I'm not really thinking about rising up the corporate ladder. You know what I mean? And that's sort of what success has come to mean in our culture. That isn't what I mean. You can't have a life that you're going to find acceptable without that, because you need the vision and the plans to give you purpose and direction. That's where all your positive emotion comes from. All your motivation is laying out plans that are worth attaining and then observing yourself moving towards them. That's the source of most positive meaning. And then also, without that structure, you're so lost that you're going to be anxious and overwhelmed. It's really like being in a foreign country, like isolated and alone with no map. I don't know where the hell I am. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. The rains are going to come, the storms are going to come, and maybe it's winter, and I don't know where I am or where I'm going.
We actually have a biological instinct for meaning that orients us in the world. And that instinct manifests itself when we place ourselves in a position in the world where we're competent, where what we're doing is working, so that we're not too terrified and anxious, but also while we're simultaneously advancing ourselves and improving our ability to cope with the world. So for example, if you watch an athlete, a high-level athlete, who's at the peak of his or her performance, you see someone who's extraordinarily practiced at what they're doing and has developed the expertise necessary to do it. But then you also see them push themselves on that developmental edge to make themselves just that much better. And that function is associated with an intrinsic sense of meaning. And whenever you see anyone manifest that, you are automatically drawn to it. You see that when an actor pushes him or herself beyond their limits. You see that when someone speaks extemporaneously and manages it extraordinarily well. And I'm trying to help people understand that this meaning is a true phenomenon. It's not a secondary thing. And also to point out that most of the time, that meaning is associated with the adoption of responsibility. Make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, you know, they were friends who, some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it, you know. They try to top your accomplishment with one of their own, hypothetical or real, or put down what you're doing, or offer you a cigarette if you're trying to quit and you've kind of done that successfully, or a drink if you've been drinking too much and are just trying to stop being an alcoholic, you know. Or yeah, they're cynical and bitter and devoted towards no good. And sometimes that's family members too, and sometimes it's even part of you, you know. But this chapter is an injunction to people, is like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And maintaining your friendships with them might not even be in their interest. And so it's a tricky argument to make, because I'm not saying, you know, whenever anyone's in trouble, you should, you know, push them into a ditch and then give them a couple of kicks. That's not the idea. The idea is that, but I had a couple of rules I didn't write about. One was be careful about whom you share good news with, and another was be careful about whom you share bad news with. And those rules ring in people's minds quite quickly. A friend is someone you can share good news with, you know. You go to them and you say, hey, look, this good thing happened to me. And they say, look, I'm so happy that happened to you. Like, way to be. And they don't think, God damn it, why didn't that happen to me? And like, you know, you didn't deserve it. Here's a bunch of reasons you're stupid and why it won't work. It's like, that's not helpful. And so I would say, like, if people are, you know what, the other thing people are doing, if they're trying to drag you down, let's say, is they're trying to see if you'll put up with it. Because they have this idea that maybe life isn't worth living and things aren't good, and that if they can besmirch, let's say, to use an archaic term, something that's pristine and good, then they demonstrate to themselves that there is no true ideal and that there's no necessary reason to be responsible and to strive forward. And so they use you as a test case. You know, I'll just push you down into the low lobster bin and see how you respond. And if you put up with it, then yeah, my cynicism is fully justified. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. That's what I'm writing about now. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful because, well, beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. The first proposition, you know, that life is suffering and that we make it worse with our malevolence, I think everyone understands that to be true. But the second is that
the best way to confront that is to shoulder responsibility voluntarily and to live in truth. I think those are even more powerful ideas, because you could say that the cure for a malaise or the treatment for a disease is more powerful than the malaise or the disease itself. And if responsibility and truth are antidotes to suffering and malevolence, then that means that they have a power that's transcendent over suffering and malevolence. You should use a calendar to structure your days, because if you know what you're doing tomorrow, it decreases your anxiety substantially, because you need that kind of structure. You need a pathway. You need to have a map, and you need to know where you're located on the map, and you need to know how you're moving forward. And that gives you hope, because you're moving towards goals that you regard as worthwhile. And it stops you from being anxious, because you're not entirely directionless and lost. And so learning how to manage your time is useful. And you can start with a calendar. You can start with simple things, like you can put in, well, when you're likely to go to bed and when you're likely to get up. And regulating that's useful. That should be relatively ritualistically consistent.
You can make your anxiety work against you or for you. And one of the ways I made a program called the Future Authoring Program that I think helps people do that. Because one of the things you see when you're talking to people and they're trying to solve problems is that they're afraid to face the problem. And so then their anxiety is working against them, and you can think about it as antagonistic to rationality. But then I could say, well, why don't you think for a while about what your life would be like if you didn't face this problem? Because if you think that through, if you have a problem and you really think through what the consequences are going to be in 3 to 5 years of not facing it, then you're going to get more afraid of not facing it than facing it. And that's great, because then your anxiety, instead of standing in front of you, instead of you having a dragon that's guarding the path in front of you, you have one chasing you down the path from behind. That's a lot more useful. And so, that's just a minimal example of the utility of getting your emotions and your thoughts aligned the same way. The same thing happens with aggression. One of the most common reasons that people come and seek psychotherapy really is because they're too agreeable. But what that means is they're not assertive enough. They haven't integrated their capacity for aggression, and so other people can push them around. And they're very conflict avoidant. And so the consequences of that across time is that you don't stand up for yourself well enough, and you get taken advantage of, and that spirals badly downward. And so partly what you do when you're doing assertiveness training with people is you find out what they're angry about. And they're usually angry if they're not assertive enough, because other people are taking advantage of them, or you could say because they're not putting their own necessities forward with enough force. It's hard to distinguish between those two things. But anyways, you get them to talk about what they're angry about. That often makes them cry, often many times. And then you get them to kind of envision what they would want to have instead, which they're often afraid to do, because people are afraid to think about what they want, because that makes it more clear when they're not getting it, and that's painful, right? Or maybe they're afraid of hoping, so they won't specify a clear aim. But anyways, you get them to think about what they might want instead. You get them to think about the costs of not pursuing that, and then you help them develop strategies for integrating their aggression and with their thinking, so that they can come up with a plan to approach the world in a more confident way. So for example, someone might come to me and say, I'm being bullied badly at work. And so then I'll say, well, what are your options? You have to put up with it? Well, we'll figure that out, because maybe you do. Maybe you don't have options. But here's how to find out. Get your damn CV together so it's pristine, right? It's ready to go. Get over your fear of a new interview, because people are generally afraid of that. Get over your fear of applying for a new job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a different job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a better job even, because maybe your fear is just making you stuck here. But I can tell you one thing, if someone's picking on you at work and you don't have options, you lose. So you get the person to start building a strategy. It's like, okay, if you're going to tell this person to stop, you have to know how to make them stop. And the one thing you need for sure is an option. And if you can't if you don't have an option, then maybe we start thinking about the fact that you need some more training or something like that, because you cannot negotiate if you don't have any power. Especially if you're dealing with someone who's really out to get you or really disagreeable. If you don't have a leg to stand on, they'll just push you over, and maybe they'll jump on you too, because that's what they're like and they enjoy it anyways. So it's no joke. So you put your options behind you, and then you start to think about strategy. So I tell people, look, if you're being harassed at work, you document it every time it happens and you write it down. So you've got like 20 stories about it, and it's fully documented. And then you go confront the person at some point, but with at least 3 pieces of evidence. And you have some sense of what you tell them about what will happen if they don't stop. So you have to figure out, well, if they don't stop, what are you going to do about it? Leave? Not if you can't leave. So you have to be able to, wield a big stick and speak softly. But you see, that way that's how you take your aggression, which is an absolutely necessary part of your psyche, and manifest it up into a sophisticated means of dealing with the world. You don't just suppress it. You say, well, I should be able to put up with it, or I wish I wasn't so angry, or something. It's like, forget that. That's all that'll happen is your blood pressure will stay high and you'll die of a heart attack, because anger, for example, is a very toxic emotion. And it does cause heart damage over time. It's the only emotion that we really know that's been linked to things like cardiovascular risk. And anger is toxic, because it's like you're driving a car, you're stepping on the gas and pushing on the brake at the same time, because anger tells you to run away and to attack at the same time, because you don't know what's going to happen. And so it really amps up the physiological demand on your body. And so if you including your heart and your musculature. So if you stay like that for like 10 years, you're going to age 20 years. And that's a bad plan. So you take your underground emotions and you integrate them into a sophisticated reality. Now, Jung said, so first of all, you unite your mind, your thinking, let's say, with your emotions. So that makes one thing instead of 2 fighting things. Okay, that's a good one. And then the next conjunction he talked about was, it isn't enough to unite your mind and your emotions. And he thought about that as a male-female pairing symbolically. That's how it would manifest itself sometimes in dreams. So you take the masculine element and the feminine element, the thinking and the emotion, unite those, and that makes you more like one thing. Okay, and now all of a sudden that's represented as symbolically male, that one thing, and it unites with something else that's now represented symbolically female. That's the body. So you take the mind emotion integration and integrate that in your body. So what does that mean? You act it out instead of just thinking. So there's this philosophical idea called now I'm going to forget what it's called. It's a contradiction in action. There's actually a technical term for it. But that's when you think and believe something, but you don't act it out. And so that means there's a dissociation in you somehow between your abstract representations and what you manifest in action. Well, that's another form of discontinuity that isn't doing you any good. The driver's going one way and the car's going the other, and you won't even be able to understand yourself if you do that. But even more, you're not putting your principles into practice. So you're dissociated, your being is dissociated. So once you get your mind and your emotions working together, then the next thing to do is to act that out consistently. So that was the second conjunction as far as Jung was concerned. And then the third one was, this is the tough one, and this is the one that's related to phenomenology. You erase the distinction between yourself and the world. Okay, that's a tough one. So imagine you're dealing with someone who's hoarding. Now, people who are hoarding are often older or neurologically damaged, or they have obsessive compulsive disorder. But then you walk into their house and there's like 10,000 things in their house. There's maybe 100 boxes, and you open up a box, and in the box there's some pens and some old passports and some checks and their collection of silver dollars and some hypodermic needles and some dust and a dead mouse and there's boxes and boxes and boxes like that in the house. It's absolute chaos in there. Absolute chaos, not order, chaos. And then you think, is that their house or is that their being? Is that their mind? And the answer is, there's no difference. There's no difference. So, you know, I could say, well, if you want to organize your psyche, you could start by organizing your room. If that would be easier, because maybe you're a more concrete person and you need something concrete to do. So you go clean up under your bed and you make your bed and you organize the papers on your desk, and you think, well, just exactly what are you organizing? Are you organizing the objective world, or are you objecting your field, or are you organizing your field of being, like your field of total experience? And Jung believed that, and I think there's a Buddhist doctrine that's sort of nested in there, that at the highest level of psychological integration, there's no difference between you and what you experience. Now you think, well, I can't control everything I experience, but that's no objection, because you can't control yourself anyway. So the mere fact that you can't extend control over everything you experience is no argument against the idea that you should still treat that as an extension of yourself. So you could say, well, let's say you have a long-standing feud with your brother. Well, is that a psychological problem? Is that him? Is it a problem in the objective world, or is it a problem in your field of being? And it's very useful to think that way, because you might ask, what could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to.